Starting now. So welcome to this ADBI featured speaker seminar. I would like to ask Dean Sonobe to provide some opening remarks. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon in East Asia and good morning in South Asia. I'm Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean of ADB Institute. In most parts of Japan, temperature is becoming lower and the air is becoming drier. And so the risk of contracting influenza or COVID-19 is increasing. I hope you will take good care of yourself. Now let's get started. Welcome to this webinar. We are delighted to welcome Professor Chandrasekhar to ADBI as the first ADBI featured speaker to discuss his recent work on regional income inequality in India. Professor Chandrasekhar is a recognized expert in his field. He's a professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai. He was awarded the Mahalanobis Memorial Medal 2016 by the Indian Econometric Society for outstanding contributions to the field of quantitative economics. Please accept my belated congratulations. I came to know the name of this medal about 30 years ago when I was writing my PhD dissertation under the supervision of Professor T.N. Srinivasan, because he had received the same medal in 1975. In 1976, the recipient was Amartya Sen, who received the Nobel Prize 22 years later. Peter Diamond, who received the medal in 1980, received the Nobel Prize 30 years later. 30 years later from now, I'll be 90 years old, if alive, but no guarantee. So I wonder if I should congratulate Professor Chandrasekhar now in advance to avoid putting pressure on him anymore. Let me go back to my effort to introduce his distinguished career as briefly as possible. He studied at the Delhi School of Economics and the Pennsylvania State University. He was a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania and a fellow of Population Council in New York. He was also a member of working group of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, Government of India. His recent work focuses on household earnings and income inequality in India, as well as studies on internal migration and urbanization. Today's webinar highlights regional income disparities in India. As we know, income inequality is almost always one of the most discussed challenges for human societies, but it has been assuming even greater importance these days. According to the Asian Development Bank's estimate, more than 80% of Asia's population lives in countries where inequality has risen in the past 20 years. In addition, the economic crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic seems to affect the most vulnerable segments of the population disproportionately, creating serious challenges for social cohesion and amplifying the divide between the rich and the poor further. Professor Chandrasekhar's study makes innovative use of income and employment data to better understand the employment structure of the economy and to inform an effective policy addressing income inequality. His study estimates interstate and intrastate rural-urban inequality and explores what explains these income divides by using decomposition analysis. I'm very much looking forward to this presentation. and hope that it will provide us with insight into the mechanism of inequality and countermeasures. With that, I conclude my opening remarks. Thank you very much. Professor Chandrasekhar, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dean Sonobe, for the very kind introduction. I'll start my share screen now. I presume my screen is visible. So
Yes.
thank you very much for the opportunity to present at the ADBI webinar today. The work that I'm presenting has been jointly done with Kartikeya Naraparaju and Ajay Sharma, who are faculty at IIM Indore. Talking about the issue of inequality to this particular audience is like bringing coal to Newcastle. So I hope you'll bear with me for a couple of minutes while we set out the context of this, why we did this particular work. This audience needs no introduction that income inequality within countries has actually increased. Over 75% of the world's population lives in countries where inequality is actually increased. That's the fact one. The second fact is that there has been actually regional divergence in India. The last survey of consumption expenditure that was done was in the year 2011-12. And what it showed was that consumption poverty got concentrated in 8 Indian states. I'll tell you which states these are. And when you actually look at the per capita state domestic product, in 2 states of India, which account for 25% of India's population, they actually continue to lag behind. And even in 2 Indian states, which you would consider as very developed and rich and industrialized and urbanized, you observe a lot of intrastate disparities. So which are the 8 states where you basically have a concentration of the poor? For those of you not familiar with India, this is Uttar Pradesh, this is Bihar, West Bengal, Jharkhand, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. So this central part of India is where you end up having a large concentration of the poor. And which are the 2 states which account for 25% of India's population, and you don't see them catching up with the rest of India? It's these 2 states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in particular. From a policy perspective, when you talk about lack of convergence or the inability of states to catch up, the way the policy looks at this, one of the richest states in India is the state of Haryana. It's a state in North India. And for policy purposes, the way it's measured is how far is the per capita state domestic product of a state from that of Haryana. So if you take the state of Bihar, which has been a lagging state, or Uttar Pradesh, which has been a lagging state, you find that the per capita state domestic product of Haryana was 4 times that of Bihar 20 years ago. And today, Haryana's per capita SDP is 5.6 times that of Bihar. A similar story is true in the context of Uttar Pradesh too. There is a recent paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by Lamba and Subramaniam, and they devote a section of the paper to this issue of regional divergence in India. They say that if you take China and other countries of the world, you do find evidence of convergence. But in India, which is this blue line, the blue dots are India here, you see that you don't find evidence of the convergence. It's the richer regions which are growing at a faster rate, and the poorer regions are growing at a slower rate. And then they ask the question, why is it that India seems to be an exception in terms of where you don't observe regional convergence? There's a paper by Chauvin et al. Where they say that India is really less urbanized. India has too few large cities. And the hypothesis or conjecture that Lamba and Subramaniam put out in the Journal of Economic Perspectives paper is that India is still urbanizing. India is still realizing agglomeration economies. And they hypothesize that moving forward, the richer regions will benefit at the expense of smaller and poorer regions, which means disparities within India could actually increase. And the explanation that they have comes from the urbanization angle. And we are going to focus on the role of urbanization in the second part of the talk. Now, why are we interested in the issue of urbanization? This audience needs no reminding that the idea goes back to the Kuznets curve. Inequality first increases and then decreases. Now, so urbanization is the driver of that. As rural population shifts to urban, this is part of the Kuznets process. And when you compare inequality at 2 points in time, what you're interested in is how much is the contribution of the change in urbanization to the change in inequality? How did the change in the urban-rural income gap, how did that affect inequality? And how did inequality change within the rural and within the urban? Now, the work that we are doing has been done in the context of India and other countries in cross-country studies. A notable paper is by Kanbur and Zhang, 2013, where they look at China, Indonesia, and India. Now, what they conclude for India is that, so the conversation on inequality in India has been very consumption-centric because India has always collected good data on consumption expenditure. And they found that inequality in consumption did increase. And for India as a whole, they said that half the increase in inequality is because of the widening urban-rural gap. 23% is because of the increase in rural inequality. 13% is because of the increase in urban inequality. And 13% is because of the increase in the share of the urban population. Now, we are also going to be doing something similar, but because we are working with one cross-section data, we are going to ask what explains differences in inequality when you observe India and observe one particular state. So in a way, the closest work that related to what we are doing is this paper by Kanbur and Zhang. In terms of the outline of the talk, the first part of the thing is going to be, we are going to show you lots of figures because we think that the figures are much more informative than showing you some numbers and tables. We're going to show you the Pence Parade, an idea that goes back to the Dutch economist Jean Pen. We'll tell you what Pence Parade is about. The focus of the talk is going to be on one key metric, which is monthly per capita household earnings. And in a couple of slides, we will explain how exactly monthly per capita household earnings is actually calculated. We are also going to do a pictorial depiction of where every Indian state is vis-a-vis India's distribution. So this is an idea that Milanovich uses. Milanovich will ask, where do different countries of the world fit into the world's income distribution? We are going to ask, where do the different Indian states fit into India's income distribution? By income distribution, we mean distribution of monthly per capita household earnings. We are going to provide estimates of inequality. Then we are also going to ask you, is your income a function, or household earnings a function of your circumstance variables? And this I will explain in some detail later. We are going to undertake a decomposition analysis. Now, typically, when you work with cross-section data, you basically do the within group and between group decomposition, and that's why typically the conversation stops. But we want to nudge the conversation a little bit further in light of the evidence that you don't find evidence of convergence in India, people having a hypothesis about the role of urbanization. We are going to ask what explains the difference in inequality between G0 of a state vis-a-vis that of India. And here, a particular paper that was written by Mukherjee and Chorox in 1982 is particularly useful. This decomposition technique that they actually developed is more in the is useful for understanding change over time, but there's nothing in the technique that stops you from understanding differences at a point in time. So similar to the Kanbur-Zhang paper, we are going to be able to say what explains difference in inequality between a particular state, for example, Maharashtra and India. And that is going to be explained by components. One is how different is the inequality in India, rural India and urban India vis-a-vis rural and urban inequality in Maharashtra. How much of the difference in inequality between India and Maharashtra is because of difference in level of urbanization? And how much of the difference in inequality at the national level India vis-a-vis a particular state Maharashtra is because of differences in the ratio of urban monthly per capita household earnings to rural monthly per capita household earnings. And we are going to tell you that Indian states actually look very different. And when you just take India as a whole, you get a picture. But when at the subnational, there are different forces at play. And this is something that Dutt et al. in their 2020 American Journal of Agriculture Economics paper with the consumption expenditure data, they kind of address these issues. In terms of data, India has always collected consumption expenditure. All conversations on poverty and inequality till this date have had a consumption focus to it. The earlier rounds of employment unemployment survey did not collect information on the earnings of the self-employed. The periodic labor force survey, the first one was conducted in 2017-18 and the second one in 2018-19. These surveys are more comprehensive. Why? It has the earnings of the regular wage salaried, it has the earnings of the casual laborers, and most important, it has the earnings of the self-employed. Now, the recall period for this is different. So for the regular wage salary, the recall period is the preceding calendar month. For the wages of casual labor is the 7 days preceding the survey. And for the self-employed, it's the last 30 days. What we do is we calculate the household earnings for 30 days. So what we have to do is we have to scale up the earnings of the wages of the casual laborers to 30 days. Some people might be uncomfortable with the idea. We could have easily scaled down the earnings of the regular wage salaried and the self-employed to 7 days. So instead of a monthly per capita household earnings, we could have calculated weekly per capita household earnings. For the analysis we do, it doesn't matter whether you measure at the monthly level or for the month or for the 7 days. Caveat, all surveys in India, there's a serious underrepresentation of the richer households, so this has to be borne in mind. The entire analysis that we do is in nominal terms. When we convert the data to real terms or adjust for state level differences in prices, the results of the decomposition analysis does not change. But if you look at the larger literature, most of the literature does the analysis in nominal terms. In terms of a welfare indicator, why do we go for monthly per capita household earnings, which is the total earnings of the household divided by the household size? There are two alternative measures. One is total earnings of the household, and the second candidate is average earnings per worker. But if you read the literature, there's a paper by Dutt and Meerman 1980 and David Lamb's review article. The literature would argue that you're better off going with the monthly per capita household earnings. And in terms of level of disaggregation, we will tell you a story by state, rural, urban. You'll see this term called NSS region, which is the National Sample Survey region, which is a geographical disaggregation below the level of the state. So India comprises of 36 states and union territories, which can further be broken down into 80 odd what are known as NSS regions. So in terms of the way we are headed, we are going to do a graphical description to highlight regional differences. And then we are going to get into the decomposition analysis in terms of what explains the difference between a particular state vis-a-vis India. I can pause here in case of, I've built in some natural places where I can actually pause during the presentation. So in case if there are any questions, clarificatory questions, I'll be happy to take them. So please do feel free to interrupt. So the first thing that we're going to show is the pence parade. What is the pence parade? A pence parade is nothing but a bar graph with a difference. And let me explain what this is. We calculate the monthly per capita household earnings for every state. These are the abbreviated state names. So let's take the case of Bihar, which is a state in East India. What is the median monthly per capita household earnings in Bihar? It's 2,000 rupees. In PPP terms, it works out to $94. In Uttar Pradesh, for example, in urban Uttar Pradesh, the median monthly per capita household earnings is 3,000 rupees or $141 PPP. So what does this mean? In Bihar, half the households have an MPCHE, monthly per capita household earnings less than $94. In UP, half the urban households have a monthly per capita household earnings less than $141. Okay, that's what the height of the bar basically represents. We are looking at the median. What does the width of the bar represent? The width of the bar represents the share of every state in all India households. So the width of the bars actually add up to 1 in case of rural, and the width of the bars actually add up to 1 in case of the urban. Okay, so what's a pence per aid? It's basically a histogram where the width of the bar basically tells you the share of each state in the total all India households. And the height is basically the median monthly per capita household earnings. And I think from this particular chart, it's evident how the median earnings actually vary from 1500 rupees to 5250 rupees in rural India. And in case of urban India, it's from 2750 to 5750 rupees. So there is a lot of variation in median monthly per capita household earnings across both rural and urban areas of a state across India. Okay, so this is just a graphical representation. Now go back to my first slide where I said there are 8 states where poverty actually got concentrated. When you look at the period 2004-5 and 2011-12, there were 8 states which account for nearly 65% of India's poor in 2011-12. It is the same 8 states which have the lowest median monthly per capita household earnings. So the story that was true in terms of low consumption expenditure in those 8 states is borne out when you look at the median monthly per capita household earnings with the earnings data. It's the same 8 states in both rural and both in urban. A priori, there is no reason to expect that the same 8 states will come up at the bottom of the rankings for both rural and for urban. Now, I've told you what the median earnings looks like. From a decomposition perspective, I've told you what's important also is the ratio of the urban to rural earnings. Here, what we have calculated, presented for you is the mean MPCHE, which is the height of the bars, is the rural urban combined. And what does the red line represent? The red line is the average urban monthly per capita household earnings to the rural monthly per capita household earnings. In Kerala, which is a state in southern India, the ratio of the urban to rural earnings, mean earnings, is 1.3. In these 3 states, Jharkhand, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh, it's over 2.5. Now, what I want to point out is, if you take Kerala, Kerala was 50% urban and 50% rural. When the 2021 census will come out, it's likely that Kerala will be as high as 70% urban. Now, Jharkhand, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh are not that urbanized. They're like less than 25% urbanized. And what I want to point out is that in these 3 states, they're just 25% urban, but look at how different the average urban earning is vis-a-vis the rural earnings. And incidentally, these 3 states are also have a mineral base. And there's a large literature in terms of evolution of inequality in resource-rich regions. Now, the divergence in this urban and rural has been documented by Martin Revelian and Murgai in their 2020 paper with the consumption expenditure data. And it's been recognized in the Indian literature that low rural living standards relative to urban actually constrains the ability of the poor to benefit from the growth process. And this is something that we will come back to with a very simple regression and address this particular issue later. Is there any questions or clarifications at this point? Or I can proceed. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is benchmarking distributions of state vis-a-vis India. As I said, it's Milanovic does that in his book, where he asks, where does every country fit into the world's distribution? Okay, and that allows him to compare distributions of specific countries also. So that allows him to make interesting statements like, where Romania's income distribution ends, Luxembourg's income distribution just begins. The poorest people in Denmark are richer than 85% of the Bulgarian population. The poorest person in US is at the 68th percentile of the world's income distribution. The poorest person is India as at the 4th percentile of the world distribution, and the richest is at the 68th. So can we basically say something similar in terms of which would provide some useful insights? And in this particular chart, it's nothing but a box plot. What we have on the y-axis is the India distribution in terms of percentiles. what you have on the x-axis are the different states. And I want you to focus on those states which are marked out in green. Okay. And what is true about this box plot? The bottom bar is basically the 25th percentile of that particular state. This is the state of Haryana. This bottom cutoff you see is the 25th percentile of that state, the rural monthly per capita household earnings. The middle bar is the median of that state, and the top bar is the 75th percentile of that particular state. Now, what is true about all these states which I have marked out in green? In all these states, the 25th percentile, okay, the household in the 25th percentile in terms of monthly per capita household earnings, the 25th percentile is above the all India median. That's what we find in case of rural India. Okay. In the next slide, we put together both rural and urban. In rural India, you do have states where the 25th percentile is actually above the all India median. In urban India, you really don't find such stark differences. But what I marked out for you is the 8 states with the concentration of the poor. And in all these states, the median is below the all India average, or just around the all India average. So in that sense, whichever way you look at it, whether you look at by median earnings or you basically look by this box plot, the bottom 8 states really come up. And we'll have quite a bit to say about these bottom 8 states when we do the decomposition analysis. Here is another way of representing the regional disparity within India. As I told you, there are 36 states and union territories, which can be broken up into 80 odd subdivisional units, which are called the National Sample Survey regions. And we have done the same box plot analysis, where the bottom cutoff is 25, the middle bar is 50, and the top bar is 75 for that particular region. And I want you to focus on the poorest region. This is from a state called Chhattisgarh. The 75th percentile actually lies below the all India median. Okay. And all these green bars, all these regions which I have highlighted in green, these regions have low levels of urbanization, fewer non-farm jobs, low earnings potential. And it's from these regions that you see a lot of out-migration to regions which are richer. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the richer regions. And in these regions, some of these regions, the 25th percentile is pretty much at the 75th percentile of India's distribution. Now, post-COVID lockdown, what you saw was there was a lot of return migration that happened to these regions. Now, it's in our conjecture, when you look at the data, it's unlikely that these regions will actually be able to absorb all the return migrants. So it's most likely that all the return migrants will actually come back to where they had actually migrated in the first place. But again, we believe that this is a nice way to actually represent, be it through this particular chart or through this particular chart, to explain regional disparities, okay, within India. So what we have basically shown you is basically a Pence parade, and also where different states of India fall vis-a-vis India's distribution. We have calculated the Gini coefficient, we calculate G0, all the related measures. Inequality in rural India, the Gini is 0.366, urban is 0.45, the combined is 0.445. In urban India, consumption inequality is 10 percentage points less than than earnings inequality. In almost all states except one, urban inequality is greater than rural. Among the interesting things is, remember I said there were 8 states with the concentration of India's poor in 2011-12. Notice that even within the 8 states, the inequality varies from 0.31 to 0.47. Inequality indeed is high. And when you look at the more urbanized states, inequality varies from 0.37 to 0.46. So irrespective of whether you're low urbanization or high urbanization, inequality seems to be high. Now, we did calculate we have calculated the Gini for all the states. I'll share the PowerPoint if somebody wants to look at the specific estimates. But how do we basically make sense of these estimates of inequality? And why should we care about the estimates of inequality? So we also calculated if you go back here, we calculated the inequality in each of these regions. Okay. Now, how do you basically make sense of the full story? Again, going back to Milanovic suggests a very neat way of actually summarizing this thing and trying to understand why we should look at this particular issue. So as I said, let's assume there are 80 NSS regions. What we do is for every NSS region, we calculate the average monthly per capita household earnings in each ventile. So there are 20 ventiles, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 90 to 95, 95 to 100. And so which means you have 20 observations every NSS region. And if you have 80 NSS regions, that's 1600 observations. So you can do one of two things. You can run a pooled regression, and I don't want to talk about the pooled regression, or you can run 20 regressions just for illustration purposes, one for each ventile. And this is something that Milanovic does in his 2015 paper with data from different countries. Now, what is this regression? You've calculated what is the average monthly per capita household earnings in each NSS region for the first ventile, that's 0 to 5, 5 to 10. Then you're basically running the regression for every ventile. Okay, so you're basically running 20 regressions. And what are the explanatory variables? Explanatory variables ideally should be the GDP of that region. We don't have the GDP of the region, so we use nightlights as a proxy. And the other explanatory variable is the inequality in the region. Now, these two variables, Milanovic calls circumstance variables, because it's really beyond what the household actually influences. And the question he asks is, how much of the variation is actually explained by these two? So when you run this regression, for the first ventile, the R square is 0.3, and for the topmost ventile, 20th ventile, the R square is 0.35. So that's basically the explained sum of squares. Of particular interest is that for the first 12 ventiles, the coefficient on Gini is negative. For the next 6, it's insignificant. And for the top 2, the Gini is actually, the coefficient on Gini is actually positive. Now, let us just step back a little bit and try to relate this back to the conversation that happens. A conversation that happens is that, is inequality bad for the poor during a time when economic growth happens? Now, for that, what you actually need is panel data. And then you do a similar analysis. And then the question that you ask is, in each ventile, what was the growth? And then you regress that on the initial inequality. So there is a paper by Milanovic in the World Bank Economic Review where he does this for the United States. And he basically shows that inequality is bad for the poor when economic growth happens. Now, in the absence of panel data, what we have tried to show is some form of association in a similar spirit. It's not causal, showing that if you are in an unequal region and you're in the top 2 ventiles, your average MPCHE is higher. But if you're on the bottom ventiles, your average MPCHE is lower. Now, given that India is actually collecting this periodic labor force data every year, maybe after 5 years, because we will have repeated cross sections, we can actually answer the question in terms of how does inequality affect the growth of earnings of people in different ventiles. In the absence of that, this is the best that we can actually do in terms of showing that it's possible, in terms of a correlation framework, that inequality is actually bad for the poor. Now so I still have around 15 minutes. I would like to focus now on the decomposition analysis. So we calculate the G0, and we basically do the between group and within group decomposition. So I'm going to skip the algebra. What we want to first focus is on the between group. Now, if you take the state of Maharashtra and Karnataka, Bombay is the capital of Maharashtra, Bombay is the financial capital of India. Bangalore is the capital of the state of Karnataka. It's the called the Silicon Valley of India. Now, Maharashtra comprises of 6 regions and Karnataka of 4 regions. Now, what we have in this blue is basically Maharashtra, the best region, and this is the worst of region. Okay, and here is Karnataka. This is the best of region, and this is the worst of region of Karnataka. What we find is that the between group component in Maharashtra is as high as 18.1. This is not a rural urban decomposition. We have 6 regions in Maharashtra and we are trying to do that decomposition. We have 4 regions in Karnataka and we are trying to do the decomposition by that 4 regions. What we find is that the between group component is highest in Maharashtra, 18.1, and also in Karnataka, 17.4. And these are more urbanized with a manufacturing base and a robust service sector. So you do find inequality within those states. Now you might ask, is this just an artifact of the periodic labor force survey? If you actually look at the per capita state domestic product data for these 2 states, it shows that the regions within these states continue to lag. So let's consider the case of Maharashtra. So the Konkan division is the richest region of Maharashtra. That's been normalized to 1. Then you're looking at where all the other 5 regions are vis-a-vis the richest region. So if you take the green line, this is the Pune division. Now the Pune division's GVA has been at 75% that of the Konkan region. And that's not changed. I've shown you data for 1 decade, for this decade. Even if you go back earlier, that pattern doesn't change. I mean, the 2 bottom regions, there is no evidence of their GVA actually catching up with that of the best region of Maharashtra. Now, I'm showing you the bottom slide. I'm showing it for you for at a point in time for Karnataka. Bangalore is the richest region. Now, these are the worst of regions of Karnataka. This is northern Karnataka. Notice that when you look at the district per capita income, which comes from the state GDP data, it's 20% that of Bangalore. So the point is, the PLFS data shows large intrastate disparities. For the states for which you have very good data at district level or the region level, it shows disparities. And there is a literature which, in the context of the developed countries, OECD countries, which says that with 70% probability, a lagging region continues to be a lagging region. And this seems to be true, at least in case, I mean, I could tell you state-specific stories, but that's not the point. I just want to point out that regional disparities persist in India and also within states, and particularly even within the richer states of India. Coming to the issue of rural-urban decomposition, the between group component is 20.6%. There's a paper by Shorrocks and Vaughan in the Journal of Economic Geography 2005, where they look at, it's a lit review, and they look at evidence from a whole bunch of countries. They also find that across a set of countries, it's around 20%. So in that sense, India is really no different. We also did the decomposition of the rural and urban, so within each state, and these are the estimates that we actually get. And let me now start telling you a little bit about how the differences in the level of urbanization across Indian states. Take the state of Bihar. Even in 2021, it is projected that less than 15% of Bihar will be urban. And what you find in the context of Bihar is that when you do the decomposition by rural-urban, the between group component is 10%. Let's take Kerala into, as I said, it's projected that by 2021, whenever the census will be conducted, which was postponed because of COVID, as much as 70% of Kerala could be urban. We find that the between group component is actually very low. And recall the graph that I showed you earlier, the ratio of urban to rural was very low at 1.3. The ratio of average urban MPCHE to rural MPCHE was 1.3. So at one end, you have Kerala, and at the other end, you have Bihar. Now look at the state of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Orissa, and I had flagged these 3 states as mineral resource rich states. Look at the very high between group component. Again, there's a paper by Kanbur, Anand and Kanbur, which came out in a Journal of Development Economics, where they formalized the whole argument of the Kuznets process. And they would say that the between group component actually should increase with the level of urbanization and then decline. What we find is, yes, in Bihar, urbanization is low, the between group component is low. In Kerala, urbanization is high and the between group component is low. But if you look at Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Orissa, the urbanization levels are low, but the between group component is high. So in that sense, it doesn't quite fit the Kuznets framework the way we actually, I know Kuznets is just a conjecture, but Does it fit the pattern? The answer is not necessarily true. Now, we did discuss Maharashtra and Karnataka, and the between group component is high. Tamil Nadu is another state which is relatively urbanized. The between group component is lower at 13.8. Now, what we are basically interested in is the differences between the state and India. And as I said, this is the decomposition. And I'm going to skip the algebra of these two slides, and I'm going to come to this particular slide. And as I said, this is a decomposition technique that goes back to Mukherjee and Chorok's 1982. That technique is typically used to explain changes in inequality over time. But there's nothing in that technique which stops us from trying to explain changes in inequality between India and that of a particular state. And let's understand what the four components are. The first component is the difference in India's rural inequality and that of the particular state. Let's assume it's Maharashtra. India's urban inequality and the particular state's urban inequality. That's the first component, weighted by the shares. The second and third component, delta VG, is basically the difference in India's urbanization rate and the urbanization rate of a particular state. So this is the difference in urbanization and how that affects the within group inequality and how that affects the between group inequality. And the last component here is the difference in the ratio of India's urban group MPCHE to rural MPCHE, monthly per capita household earnings, average urban incomes to rural incomes, India, vis-a-vis how that's different from that of a particular state. Okay, so recall the paper by Kanbur and Zhang, which finds a mention in the ADB report of 2012 or 2013, if I'm not wrong. In that sense, they are also trying to do something similar. They are trying to explain what led to change in inequality or the increase in inequality in India at 2 points in time. We're using a slightly different decomposition method to basically say how do you explain differences in inequality within India. So what we effectively is asking is the following. India's G0 is 0.341. Bihar's is 0.165. So in a sense, Bihar's inequality is 51% less than that of India. What explains this? In India's inequality is 0.341. Kerala's inequality is 0.271. What explains this difference? That is what we are actually interested in. And what we are going to do is, so if you compare India with a state like Bihar, so you're getting a difference of 51%, it's a 51% difference. What we will do is we will actually break up that 51% into each of these components. And that's what we are actually going to do. Okay. I have, in the interest of time, I have not gone into the economic structure of each of these states. What we will actually do is in the question and answers, if there is actually specific questions on how the economic structures of the states is actually different, how this might actually explain some of the results, I'll be happy to come back to this particular slide where we constructed for you the distribution of earnings by sector of work. Okay, let's start with this. What explains the difference between India and Bihar? As I told you, Bihar's inequality is half of that of India. As I said, Bihar is 12% urban, India is 35% urban. And what we find is the difference in level of urbanization accounts for 19%. So if you look here, 25 plus 11 plus 8 plus 7 equals 51. Bihar's inequality is 51% lower than that of India. How can this 51% be broken up? Out of this 51%, 19% is just because of differences in level of urbanization. If you take Kerala, Kerala is more urbanized than India. Tamil Nadu is more urbanized than India. And if you look at inequality in Kerala, it's 19% lower than India. In Tamil Nadu, it's 28% lower than India. But what you see is that that fact that it's lower than India is basically driven by the fact that in these two southern states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the ratio of urban to rural average income is that ratio is lower. And that's what basically pulls the inequality down. But if you just the fact that higher level of urbanization contribute to inequality, the answer is yes, it does pull it up. But when you look at an aggregate, uh, it is this component that basically dominates. Okay, uh, we are highlighting the case of West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh because the level of urbanization of these two states is similar to that of India, and this is just a common sense check to make sure that this method actually works. We find that difference in level of urbanization between West Bengal and India, because they're pretty much similar, it doesn't explain any of the fact that West Bengal is less unequal than India. Similarly, in the context of Andhra Pradesh, the fact that Andhra Pradesh inequality is 21% less than India, that has nothing to do with difference in level of urbanization. Why? Both these states have an urbanization rate very close to that of India. Now, this is my last but one slide. Let's look at the three states which are rich in mineral resources and have low levels of urbanization. Recall, I had shown you in that particular chart that in these three states, the average urban to rural, average urban earnings to average rural earnings was about 2.5 in these three states. Okay, and it was significantly higher than that of India. Did we pick that up? Does this decomposition pick that up? Yes. Let's take Chhattisgarh. Chhattisgarh's inequality is higher than that of India by 13%. And what is this driven by? It's here. This is the component that drives that thing. Okay, sorry. And if you take Jharkhand, Orissa, it is the fact that in these three states, the ratio of urban to rural means is higher than that of India is what drives inequality. And important to note is that these three states have lower levels of urbanization than India. And that's why these components here are actually negative. And in these three states, what is the significance of within rural inequality and within urban inequality? They don't have too much of a role to play. In terms of comparing our results with what the literature would do is, the literature would further break up this delta WG in terms of rural and urban. But given that the focus of our paper is on urbanization, how urbanization explains difference in inequality, we have combined those two components here. And instead, it's these two components, delta due to urbanization rate on within group and delta urbanization rate due to between group is what we want to focus on. So to quickly wrap up, what's the basic key takeaway message? It's that India is unequal. There are large disparities. We have done a graphical description of regional differences using Penn's Parade, also asking where Indian states fit into the India's distribution. We provide estimates of inequality. We told you about the importance of circumstance variable. In terms of explaining the difference in inequality of India vis-a-vis particular state, there is no consistent pattern where you can say it's urbanization that basically on which you can hang your full story. Now, some poor states with lower levels of urbanization have higher urban-rural MPCHE. We contrasted Kerala and Bihar. Kerala, a rich state, high level of urbanization. Bihar, a poor state with low level of urbanization. And even among the richer states, we find differences. And I'll be happy to talk about rural-urban linkages in the Q&A. And this kind of concludes my presentation. So thank you for your attention. And in case if there is actually interest on the policy aspect, I just would like to say that we have a Finance Commission of India, which is supposed to make allocations in terms of the divisible pool of tax resources to be shared between the center and the state. It's a constitutional provision. How the state governments should be sharing the tax resources to the districts, there is a constitutional provision for that. There's a constitutional provision for addressing disparities within a state. The example of Maharashtra and Karnataka. I mean, I've deliberately not gone into the policy aspects of it and just tried to tell you a graphical description of how unequal India is and the role of urbanization, to what extent does difference in urbanization explain differences between India and that stuff. But if there is interest, I can come back and talk about the policy aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chandra, for an interesting presentation. We're now entering the Q&A round where we have devoted to Q&A from the audience. To kick this round off, I have a couple of questions and comments myself that I'd like to ask. I was interested to see that you found that urban inequality is actually higher, when I think that the literature in this field finds that as one moves towards higher rates of urbanization, that income inequality actually declines. So how do you square your results against these results in the literature? The second element of this question relates to whether you've looked at some sort of dynamic in your results. So how this rural-urban relationship may change over time, and whether the results you found are due to changes in one or the other, because of course, the policymaker is interested in the dynamic in order to identify where the problem is and where policy action needs to take place. Mm-hmm. Finally, I would ask what concrete policy actions can derive from these results. In particular, we've seen recent shifts towards increasing use of digitalization, and this may be one of the aspects that could be capitalized upon to address the overall issue of inequality. So I'll just ask you those questions, and then we can invite other people as well. I see Peter has a question. He can come in after Chandra answers my questions. Thank you.
So can we tell you a story of change? Answer is no. As I said, the periodic labor force survey was just conducted in 2017-18 and 2018-19. The only dynamic story that we can tell you is that the usual suspects in terms of which are the geographical concentrations of poverty, those are the same regions with low monthly per capita household earnings. That's the only thing that we can tell you. If you have data, as I said, the periodic labor force survey is being conducted every year. So maybe once we have 3 more rounds of the periodic labor force survey, we will be able to tell a very compelling story about did anything change in the last 5 years. But if you take the data for 2017-18 and 2018-19, there's really nothing that changed in that respect. Okay. So absence of earnings data actually constrain us from telling you a dynamic story. At best, we can allude to the patterns that we know from the consumption expenditure literature. Please note, this is the first time that we are actually trying to do a rigorous analysis from an earnings perspective. Mm-hmm. Till now, all conversations have been consumption-centric. So that was the second question. The third question in terms of policy is that in India, the central government collects the income taxes. Under the constitution, you're supposed to set up something called the Finance Commission of India, which basically decides how the taxes are supposed to be apportioned across the different states. Now, typically what happens is that they will just take the state per capita state domestic product to figure out how much of the money should go to the different states. There is a formula. They really don't take into account intrastate disparities while making allocations. But the constitution also has a provision for something known as the State Finance Commission, given India's 3 tiers of the government, where state governments are supposed to be allocating resources so that regional imbalances actually get addressed. But if you actually go and look at how the state finance commissions work, they will just go by a rural-urban criteria or a population criteria, because you really don't have good data on district-level incomes. So from a policy perspective, we think that with better data being collected, the state finance commissions have a very important role to address regional imbalances. And in terms of constitutional provisions, again, there is a concept called development board, which comes under the authority of the governor of a state who is not an elected official, who is supposed to advise the state government in terms of you need to allocate money such that regional differences actually get addressed. We have that experiment going on in 2 states, but it has not quite been successful. So in terms of policy implications, I would say that maybe the Finance Commission of India should recognize the kind of disparities evident from the survey data, point 1. And the state finance commissions have to start recognizing the intrastate disparities when they make allocation to the different districts. So that's my first round of answer to the whole issue of policy. In terms of importance of institutions, on the issue of rural and urban, So let's take the case of Kerala. Uh, Kerala, rural-urban is pretty much 50-50 at the time of the survey. And when you look at the earnings from rural and earnings from urban of the households, it's pretty much 50% of the earnings come from rural and 50% of the earnings come from urban. Contrast this with a state like Maharashtra. Bombay is the capital of Maharashtra, which is 44% urban, but 66% of the earnings comes from the urban. So it's 44% urbanization, but when you look at earnings, 66% of the earnings come from the urban sector. So in that sense, is it about productivity differentials within the state that basically drives it? The point that we actually, maybe I should reiterate what I wanted to say, is that the standard, so for example, if you try to see, does the Kuznets curve hold? Higher the level of urbanization, then there is a turning point and then it comes down. And by the way, the Kanpur-Zhang paper does this for India and says, where is that turning point? We can't do that with this particular PLFS data. If you have a longer enough stuff, we can actually start talking about the turning point. This again goes back to the dynamic question. In one particular Indian state, actually urban inequality, rural inequality, so there are exceptions. The decomposition analysis at least helps us identify what is the underlying story. Can we offer an explanation? The answer is no.
Okay, yeah, I understand there with the survey evidence, you're limited in terms of looking at a longer term dynamic, and that would certainly be of interest in later studies. And maybe I can ask Peter to ask his question now. Please go ahead, Peter.
Hey, thanks very much, Chandra, for a fascinating presentation. I was certainly struck by your findings about the big gap in the ratios between the urban and rural per capita earnings across different states. And do you have any particular stories about what drives those differences?
Okay, so my answer is going to be partially facts and partially hypothesis. So you've got to bear with me on that. So if you take certain states, the extent of rural-urban integration varies by state. And what does it actually vary by? So in the survey, you will have a question which is about the place of residence. Is it rural or urban? And then they will have a question on place of work in terms of is it rural or is it urban? Now, if you take a state like Haryana, which is the richest state in India with which I had benchmarked the other states, if I remember right, 45% of the rural earnings come from people working in the urban. In Tamil Nadu, a large proportion of the rural earnings come from people working in the urban. So in that sense, the importance, so this is where my hypothesis comes, which is that the extent of rural-urban linkages in the labor market is driven not by migration, but more by daily commuting. The number of people who commute from rural to urban every day is a huge multiple of those who seasonally migrate or permanently move. So one thing that can act, so it's possible. So what we find is in the poorer of states of Orissa, Chhattisgarh, those resource-rich states with low levels of urbanization, we really don't find too much of rural-urban commuting. Okay, and we don't have enough reason. The data is not rich enough for us to explain, is it a skills mismatch that the people can't go from rural to urban, or what basically drives it? But one linkage which we have explored using the data is the share of earnings of rural households from the urban. And in the more urbanized states, this is necessarily true. I'm sorry, it was a slightly long-winded answer to your very pointed question.
Thank you very much. I have another question from Linda Arthur from the ADBI. Linda, please go ahead. You should be able to speak.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much for your presentation. I noticed on the list of states that I think it was Himachal Pradesh that was on the other extreme end from Bihar, I think. And I was wondering if that is more because of a rural-urban dynamic, or because the state government there has pursued social policies that would have affected the level of economic equality in Himachal.
So the data does not allow, so we've tried to look for an explanation for Himachal Pradesh, and we couldn't come up with a convincing one based on what data is actually available. So your guess is, or a conjecture is as good as mine.
All right. Well, thank you for your candid response.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're now coming to the finish of our allotted time. So I would like to give the final words to Dean Sanoba, and maybe Dean Sanoba has a question, or if not, then final remarks from Dean Sanoba. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you, Professor Chandrasekhar. Yeah, so I learned that there are many stories. So urban-rural gap can be, very different on the different levels of state and region. And the within region, urban-rural, diversity, there are different, stories or different natures, and maybe depending on the root cause of the disparity. So even in a very theoretical model, abstract model with completely homogeneous people, and then, but there are kind of transportation costs and agglomeration economies. So there are people living in the urban area and living in the rural area. And then the income level would be different. But in terms of utility or welfare, they are all equal. But of course, there are a lot more reasons for the, behind the difference between the people in urban and the rural areas. So education and the lack of infrastructure and the lack of or history or culture, everything. So for India, about how many major stories or narratives explaining the urban-rural disparity? So, so more than 3 or more than 5? If you classify very finely, then the theory doesn't help people. But if you are too broad, then that's too boring. Or also doesn't help people. So how many types good?
So if I can answer your question, if there's one thing that we can say is that inequality will increase in India. If you just take the state of Bihar and UP, which account for 25% of India's population, I mean, the state of Bihar and UP are larger than some of the countries of the world, just their population. So Bihar urbanizes from 12% to 30% or 40% within whatever time frame, you are going to see an increase in inequality in India. In terms of like other southern states, have they reached the turning point? Are they declining? Is something that we can actually say maybe 3-4 years down the line when the more data actually comes in. So I would say that when you look at the inverted U and the Kuznets framework, etc., it's not really about the inverted U, but more about the process. And what we are saying is that if you just look at urbanization as the mechanism, different states are at different stages, and can they come up? It's possible that they fit one story. At the moment, they look very disparate.
I see.
That would be my summary.
I see. That, yeah, I think that's a good summary.
But then there is also geographical traps of low earnings. This is true in the context of when you looked at the consumption expenditure data, and then when you look at the earnings data. So it's kind of consistent that a lagging region continues to be a lagging region. You don't see them catching up. And that's where institutions have an important role to play, in my opinion.
I see. Well, yeah, I think I learned a lot from today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
There seems to be a very long way to go before, giving a good guidance to policymakers. So, and then, yeah, we have done work here at the ADBI on the income inequality, such as the recent book project. But I think that we should work more on income inequality issues. Yeah, we hope we will have some kind of collaboration in future.
Sure, my pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much, and
Thank
have
you.
a good day. Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, Dean.
to everyone, so ADBI is going to have an annual conference next week, starting from Tuesday, and then the conference will last for 3 days. And then on the first day, it will start from 9 o'clock in the morning with a keynote speech by the ADB President, Mr. Asakawa, followed by the keynote speech given by the Professor Rajam of Chicago University, who was governor, used to be a governor of the Central Bank of India. But he is very young, so he's a kind of genius. And then followed by the many presentations, and then many famous researchers and practitioners. So please check your schedule and our link. So John or
Yes.
Peter, where the people can get the link to
Yes.
our conference?
On our ADBI events page, the link is there. You can just go to December and you will easily find the link to the event itself and how to register.
Okay, so Tsubota-san and other people from joining this webinar today from outside of ADBI, yeah, please join us next week. Okay, and of course, ADBI people will join us. Okay, so have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much for your participation, and please participate more in ADBI events in future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you, sir.